Dharma took a class with me a couple of years ago where I was presenting some of my research, and we started this conversation a couple of years ago, and she interviewed a few of us and titled this piece Design Heard, Interpretations of the Design Process. And I think that's actually quite beautiful, thinking about the process of hearing design, which process-wise, are we good? Okay. You live process. Improv is all about process, taking a prompt and turning it into something else. And so I feel like I'm very simpatico with you studying a process and knowing that that's sort of one of the biggest outcomes in life, is to be aware of process. And that's what drives my research program. I've been looking at design processes for a couple of decades now, and I'll talk about studying design, why I study design, and how we do some representations, and then hopefully hear some responses from you. And first I want to note that the research that I'll be talking about is not just me, it's actually a core set of wonderful people for the last couple of decades. And so the amazing people up here, I wish you could meet all of them, but you will see their work in the next 20 or 30 minutes. I wanted to start with sort of the acknowledgement that design is bigger than just engineering. I'm an engineering professor. I learned engineering design. I study engineering design. But design really is something that we do as humans. It's just part of the human endeavor. There's a very famous cognitive psychologist, Herb Simon, who in a treatise that he wrote in 1969, defined design, or who designs, as everyone designs who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. Any kind of existing situation to any kind of preferred one. So basically going from state A to state B to solve a problem, to satisfy a need, lots of different things actually drive us to design. So who designs? Architects, authors, engineers, chefs, musicians, improv singers, landscape architects, so basically all of us. And the kinds of things to go from state A to state B, examples are the folks in this room taking a prompt and turning it into a performance, a landscape architect who takes an empty yard and turns it into a garden, chefs, all of us, moms and dads, taking an empty plate and turning it into dinner, or an author taking a blank page and turning it into a poem. It's that process of turning it into that can get really complex. And when you look at engineering examples, going from state A to state B are lots of different kinds of states A and to states B. So to improve human health, engineers develop things like X-ray machines and MRI machines and heart valves to help the need for humans to get from one side of a river to another. Humans developed ways to do that. They swam, they created boats, they eventually made bridges. Desire to explore, and we go out into space. Deal with pests in the garden, then we develop pesticides, and that sort of leads me to the fact that some of the things that we do and we apply as science and technology to solve problems may have unintended consequences. So that problem of pests in the garden, developing a pesticide actually can lead to things like DDT, and we all know Rachel Carson's treatise. The hole in the ozone, developing from refrigeration and aerosols. Failure of early heart valves, pretty deadly consequence. Bridge failures that we just heard of one just a couple of weeks ago. So these are all examples of unintended consequences. And so as an educator, what I want to do, and my raison d'etre, is to figure out how engineers do design, so we can figure out how to teach engineering students to think broadly before they start diving into developing a solution. To think broadly so you can frame a problem and understand what kinds of potential unintended consequences may happen. To frame a problem and think broadly so you don't just run with your first idea, which might not be the best idea. And so hence the research program that I have been embarked upon for the last couple of decades to understand engineering design, to understand engineering design expertise. So I look at how engineering experts, practicing engineers do design, and then I look at how incoming first-year students do design, and I look at how graduating engineering students do design. So I can see the kinds of processes that each of these groups implement, so that then I can say, for incoming first-year student, what is it that you could do to look like an expert? What are the kinds of processes that you could implement so you do think broadly and not dive in and just go with your first idea? So I'm all about context, and in order to get there, I'm all about design and looking at design processes. And that's how I think that us engineers in the room, Wendy and Giovanna and I, are simpatico with the improv singers in the room. It's looking at that process and trying to figure out how to describe it. So the research that I'm going to talk about and then the representations that came from that are all based around this one particular experiment where I asked people to design a playground for a fictitious neighborhood with a made-up scenario with constraints like you need to have 12 kids busy and they're age 1 to 10, those kinds of constraints. What I asked people to do was talk aloud while they solved the problem. We videotaped it, we audio taped it, and that became our corpus of data. That's what we did our analyses on. It's a research method called verbal protocol analysis, and each of the individuals took up to 2 to 3 hours in a lab-based setting. I did this with 26 incoming freshmen, 24 graduating seniors, and 19 engineering experts. So we had a bajillion hours of tape to dive into and analyze. These are the set of constraints that I talked about. Needed to be safe, need to remain outside all day, comply with Americans with Disabilities Act. You can't just run into the hardware store and buy stuff. You have to make it because we're really on a tight budget. Why have engineers design a playground? Because I wanted it to be something that incoming first-year students felt they could approach. You don't need to know all of the analysis to figure out the forces of a little 2-year-old's torso going down a slide to feel like you can get some traction with doing a design of a playground. So that's the rationale for the actual problem I chose. This is a representation of the experimental design that we had first-year graduating and practicing engineers in a room. They could ask the experiment administrator for pieces of information, like, do you have any information on the climate in the area? And the person would say yes and give them a piece of information. So we tried to make it as realistic as we could. And once we collected the data, and with these wonderful audio, we had somebody transcribe, undergrad students, transcribe, that was the 75 undergrads in that original slide. Thanks a lot, Cindy. Transcribed the data, segmented it, each phrase into an idea unit. So everything that somebody said was segmented into just one idea. And then what we did was we took each phrase and we applied one design activity code to it. And this is where you can get engineers to have knockdown, drag out fights. To say, okay, so only engineers would actually have any kind of disagreement on what design is. What I did was a content analysis from textbooks that we use to teach design, so I could say, this is my authority, this is the theory with the small t that I'm proposing to use. And in those textbooks and how we teach design, we assume, we'd already identified the need, but people define a problem, gather relevant information, so they're scoping out a problem, They develop alternative solutions by generating ideas, doing modeling, so the detailed calculations and modeling, figuring out feasibility of analysis, evaluation, does this make sense, decision on final outcome, communicate to somebody else what the final design is. So it took like maybe 10 years to go from data collection to actual showing what the data were. This, having the results. These are examples from a transcript so you can see the kinds of things that somebody said and that we would identify. So if someone said, any equipment you design must be safe for the children, that's a problem definition statement. Do you have a list of materials? That's actually gathering information. Generating ideas, something like trying to think like what should I do, what would be more sturdy in this case? And so you can imagine the arduous task that the undergrads who were doing the coding went through to rigorously assign one code to each statement. Two people did it independently and then compared. If there were differences, you would argue to consensus. And so this is a long-term, rigorous and arduous, and Wendy and I are doing that, and Giovanna on a different data set, and so all amicably. Yeah, there you go. So then once we have the transcripts and we've coded them, then what we do is we analyze the counts of the numbers of codes, but what we're talking about tonight more is how we represent the codes over time in a timeline. And that representation ends up being pretty powerful. So here is a representation of a first-year student. I also want to mention that we evaluated the quality of the playground they designed, looking at playground standards. So we not only have a description of their process, but we also have a rating of the quality of the product that they actually ended up designing. This is a timeline representation of the design process. So you could imagine you as an improv singer getting a prompt, and then your brain going, what am I doing and how am I doing it? It just happens right so fast for you guys, like almost instantaneously. I would love to study you in a different decade. Anyway, so in this timeline, this person did some problem definition, gathered a little bit of information, generated some ideas, did a whole bunch of modeling, went back and gathered some information throughout the process. So this is a timeline representation of coded design process data. Anybody have any questions on that? Yeah.
But the quality score, do I relate that to grade or to the textbooks that you're holding them to?
Yeah, it's mostly the textbooks that we're holding them to. We actually graded the quality of the playground design they had with respect to actual playground standards.
All right.
And we also did a qualitative assessment, like would the kids actually have fun? So those kinds of things. Yeah.
Just because modeling is so frequent in a lot of them, I just want to make sure I understand. Modeling is like literally being like, this is an idea.
What do I do with it?
Putting the idea
Yeah,
out.
like okay, I think I'm gonna do a slide. Would be generating ideas, and then I would go, okay, so let's see a slide. How high would it have to be? Maybe 8 feet, and then if I had something that started with the bottom, went down to the top, it would be longer on that part, so that would be 14 feet, something like that. So that would be an example of modeling. Yeah. So it's the specific. Yeah.
We try ourselves to stop doing that.
Yeah, see.
Got right to the playground.
Yeah. Okay, I like it. See? Okay, so that's what we have to do. We have to figure out an improv timeline. Okay, we'll start on that tomorrow. How's that? Okay, so this is just giving a couple of examples of gather information. Do you have a list of materials? And here is a modeling. I won't need supports in the middle, but I'll need supports at either end. That's the kind of good question. What do you mean by modeling?
So,
yeah.
But you have decision in there somewhere too, right?
Yes.
Where does that fit with what you just said?
So decision would be
About the final product.
it's either about the final product or how am I going to attach the part of the slide to the ladder? Do I need screws or rivets? So it would be like, a screw or a rivet.
Rather than a decision about.
It's
what
both. It's both. So it's the smaller ones, I think I need a rivet here, not a screw. And it's the bigger ones, I think I don't want to do a merry-go-round. I want to do a slide, and I think I want to include benches so the parents have some place to sit.
Okay, so the
Yeah.
modeling decisions, it's more.
Modeling, it's like, okay, what was the budget? How am I going to afford that? And it's the, with the details of the specific pieces. Okay, cool. So I said that we looked at the quality of the actual product, and we did all of this coding and representing for all 26 incoming first-year students. And what you have here are 3 representations. One, a representative timeline for somebody who had a low quality playground design. A representative timeline for somebody who had an average quality playground. And a representative timeline for somebody who had a high quality playground.
Wow, that's cool.
I'm going to ask you to look at the differences in a minute. The next slide
Wow.
is for the graduating students.
So interesting.
Representative timeline for the low quality.
Mm.
Representative timeline for average quality and design. Representative timeline for high quality and design.
Yes.
That's really interesting.
It is very interesting.
So I'm curious to know what you are thinking when you say, that's really interesting. So what I'd like you to do is, with a colleague, look at what you see as similarities and differences across the first year and the graduating students, and similarities and differences across quality scores. So sink into the representations for a bit, talk with your neighbor. Oh, question.
Is it a literal timer?
This is a literal
Yeah,
timeline.
3
This is basically 3 hours, from 0 to 3 hours. So this person took about 35 minutes.
Well, I see lots of generating ideas, right here. There's practically no generating ideas in this group. And extra together,
What is it,
and generating ideas. Well, I see lots of generating ideas, right here. There's practically no generating ideas in this group. And extra together, first beginning.
Okay, so coming back, it was, you guys dove right into it. I am not surprised. What kinds of differences are you noticing? Okay.
So what I saw in the high quality, first of all, that the first year student, and then we both looked at it and said that there are first year students who are really, really good, and there are seniors who are really, really good, and they seem to have it to start with. And then the other thing is the people who got high scores spent a lot more time and a lot more energy in the gathering ideas and the generating ideas. The design, the actual modeling is happening toward the end.
Yeah.
But they're spending a lot of time going back and forth
Right.
and,
So
and
you see-
saying,
You see gather information all the way through. Yeah. Yeah.
and generate ideas,
Checking it,
lots
generate
of
ideas.
generation.
Yeah, and another thing I heard you say is that for those people modeling, the start of modeling was shifted down a little bit.
Right.
Yeah. What else?
The other thing I noticed is on the high score, the communication goes all the way across, and they're in communication a lot more than other folks are.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and in this case, individual solving problem communication was them attending to the fact that they needed to actually turn
That's
that
true.
design over to someone else. Yeah. Yeah. So communication. Yeah. Yeah. Happened down here, didn't happen up here so much. What else? Are there anything else that popped out?
I'm excited about the amount of time they're spending doing feasibility when they have high scores. Like actually, like this is the idea about it.
Feasibility.
But right, does it work?
Work.
Yeah, will it actually work? Yeah, super cool, super cool. So, what we did was looked at these other fabulous observations. When we actually look at this sample size is much larger than normal verbal protocol studies. The reason I used so many people was so that I could actually develop measures and then do statistical differences across, because as us engineers know, us engineers tend to value numerical data more than qualitative data. So as my audience were engineers, what I wanted to do is statistically different comparisons. And what we found looking across the data from these two samples is compared to first-year students, graduating seniors had higher quality designs on average. I was really, I could publish, you can publish negative results, but tenure looked a lot easier with that. Graduating seniors tended to scope the problem more effectively by considering more categories of information. So looking at gathering more information, looking at a broader set, made more transitions among the design activities. So you saw smaller swaths of lines and progressed farther into the design process. That was you see communication happening more likely on the higher quality and with the graduating seniors. And those differences were statistically significant. I use these data and representations to teach undergraduate students, engineering students, about design. And they make the same kinds of observations that you do. And here's some examples. The highest quality scores in both groups use a greater range of activities instead of just modeling. I like this one. Problem definition is key to the overall project. Remind yourself of what you're doing and what's really being asked. Pick your head up from the paper and analyze the problem. My favorite observation of all came with somebody who sketched on top of the graduating senior timeline this cascade shape and identified it as the ideal project envelope. So what this person is saying is a sufficient amount of time is spent scoping the problem, thinking about what the problem is they're solving before diving into a focus on modeling, and then at the end worrying about feasibility and evaluation and communication. And so there's sort of a progression of design or of good design.
Cynthia, question?
Yeah.
I just had a comment, and that is, so I've done software development, and I've also done project management in software development. And so I looked at lots of graphs like this about software development.
Yeah, so Gantt charts.
Project management.
Yeah.
And that going like this so that you're in the higher steps, for longer, that is very familiar in that.
Yeah,
So
yeah. That's a cool observation.
And I have a question about that. When I look at the shape, which is it's very beautiful, but how you could change it by redefining the sequence. You've got things that are not necessarily in sequence.
Yes.
If you shifted those
Yes.
around, wouldn't that change?
That is a fabulous observation. Absolutely. If we changed this order, then you would see a different shape, or you would see no shape at all. It could look random. This order actually comes from the content analysis of the design text that we teach engineers from. So when you look across design models, design models in general tend to talk about defining the problem first, about gathering information, and then about generating ideas. So the order is super important in terms of making all the observations that you just made. Yeah. And it came from the text itself, so it didn't come from me manipulating the data. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, so I have done research in like ethnography, like the humanities. And I feel like this is maybe too political, please forgive me if you don't agree, but I feel like my critique of the way that business majors, no offense to everyone, make decisions is that they don't do the gathering ideas or gathering information or the problem definition long enough.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to me that like my understanding of ethnographic research is very similar to
Right, and so what you're saying is the people who you're talking about, what kind of major they would have, don't do much gathering information and thinking about scoping the problem before they make a decision.
And in that case, it
Yeah.
would be like talking to humans as opposed to.
As opposed to doing algorithmic, absolutely. Yeah.
So I get confused when you talk about the problem
Mm-hmm.
or the product, because in
Yeah.
a way, the problem
Wow, these
you're
are
talking
such
is
cool
really
questions.
a product.
Yes. So
And that's very different than
so in this case, the problem they were solving was to design a playground for a fictitious neighborhood. And so the product was the designed playground.
But the
Yeah.
problem, I would think problem definition in that first thing would be something like, what kinds of, you'd be saying, what do kids like to do in these different ages?
Yeah.
You'd be gathering more information about to
Okay.
help you answer the, it's
Right.
not just what is the
Define the
basic
problem.
problem.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And doing an adequate job of that problem scoping
Right.
before you dive into modeling is huge.
And to
That's
me,
hugely important.
That part should have its own thing, because it should be sit and listen or watch, observe.
Yeah.
That's the gathering part.
That's-
before
But,
you really
they're
know
never
the
going to have
problem.
that in 3
I know,
hours.
in a student thing, I understand, it's very
Yeah.
different, but in real life, you can't just say, oh, that's what I'm gonna have, and
Right. Listening being an important way to gather information, I think, is another really great observation. So to move on to the next data that we looked at, were the 19 practicing engineering experts. And the engineering experts, the lower performing, lower quality product representative timeline, average quality product representative timeline, high product representative timeline. And if you then look at all three first year graduating senior and engineering experts, and then do what a mechanical engineering friend of mine from Stanford says, a squint analysis. So do a squint analysis, and you can see different patterns across the three samples. And then if we did the statistical analysis and found that compared to the students, the experts spend more time solving the problem in all design stages, so they stay at the table longer. They live with the problem longer. They consider more objects in their design process, another thing that we looked at, considering like, a slide, a swing, a bench, a garden. Scope the problem more effectively by gathering more information and covering more categories. So again, experts know the importance of that, and are more likely to exhibit a cascade pattern of transitions. So across all the engineering experts, they're more likely to have a cascade pattern. So, yeah.
I'd love to offer this because
Yeah.
I don't know anything about anything, and I'm just enjoying just having it wash over me. And so, from my ignorance point of view, when I looked at the graduating students at first,
Yeah.
what I thought of was the movie Amadeus, when Mozart presented his piece to the prince or whomever, and he said, "Oh, I just have one tiny problem." "What is that, sir?" Too many notes." Yes, if you could just remove the notes. But that's what I thought when I saw it, because they made so much use of all of the notes.
Yes, making use of all of the notes. Yeah. So as you gain in expertise, you're making use of more of the notes. So looking across all of these kinds of observations that you made, when I go into teaching undergraduate students about design, we teach them about, well, first of all, we have them engage in the representations and come up with the insights themselves, because that's the way to teach, right? And all the things we've just been saying, spend enough time understanding the problem up front, gather information throughout the process, revisit the problem definition, use a broad set of design activities. There's so many notes. Iterate and transition among design activities, spend sufficient time modeling. Like the freshmen, this was a surprise. We thought that most students, and this is what most incoming students look like, gathered a few pieces of information, came up with one idea, and modeled the heck out of it. That was like 18 of the 24. around 6 of the 24 actually never could come up with an idea to go with.
Right.
Yeah.
They read the problem, came up with an idea, thought of something else, read the problem, and then quit.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. And then on average, more of the seniors actually were able to engage and do problem scoping and then getting into modeling. So it was nice for us to see, wow, it looks like the 4 years of education did something.
Right.
And I have other experimental data that's within subject. So these are across subject data. But we see this actually with other problems and within subject experimental design as well.
So are you gonna go back to the freshmen and now did you test them at graduating senior time to see if they made it?
I did that not with playgrounds, but I have 3 other problems, and I did do a longitudinal within subject experimental design, and I can talk about that in the next time we get together. But we see similar patterns.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we see similar patterns, which is a really cool thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just one more comment, and that is, one thing that you did not call out there that I noticed is that the people who had better designs had decision points sooner and more of them, as opposed to going through to the end and saying, okay, now I'm making a decision.
Yeah.
But they made decisions along the way.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
have the feeling
And-
they probably changed some of them as they went too.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember they were at different levels. Somebody had already asked, like, was it like, am I using a swing or a slide, or am I using a rivet or a screw? And so it was at lots of different levels, but definitely engaged in decision making more often. Okay, so representing design processes. It's fabulous that you could see all these things through these timeline representations, and we use them to teach. And if you compare the timeline representation to node and arc kinds of representations, which is how when engineers teach about design processes, we are much more likely to say, first you identify a need and then you go. And look, this arrow means iteration. That is so abstract when you can see iteration happening like this. And so representing things makes a difference. And my students who I work with can affirm this. Once you see a timeline, everything you see are timelines. Birds on a wire, timeline.
Or notes. But
Okay. Or notes,
Right.
exactly. I was in Malaysia actually doing some teaching last November, and I did a batik of the freshmen. I had to talk them into actually letting me do this instead of a flower. They were like, what? Or a mobile, or you can see there's all kinds of visual display of data, ways where you can see timelines. Or this morning this was a shadow of a gate we keep this morning of the sun coming through the gate where we keep my dog from doing things where he shouldn't. And this is actually a rock that my daughter and her friend found on the beach last month. They're like, Mom, this looks like your timeline. Yes. We have a colleague of mine, Janet McDonnell, from Central St. Martin's in London, developed a couple of design briefs where she has people dive into the data and come up with different representations. Or then do a design problem themselves, observe themselves doing it, and represent their own design process. And these are all visual transformations that students made from the data that generated the timelines or their own design. So these are the kinds of things that can be prompts, can be offerings of different ways of looking at design. And somebody mentioned that the timelines might actually look like musical scores. So I heard that so often. I am not a musical person, but I could even see that. And I heard that so often that we actually had the timeline sonified. sound of average design.
I'm very average.
So that middle
Okay.
bell is modeling.
Okay.
Yes, that's modeling.
Yeah. And see, average design can't stop.
Yeah, you get stuck.
There we go. Yes, you get stuck. Okay. So that is, and you can go to, I can get you to the CELT soundtracks. I don't know, do any of you know Clarence Acox and Bob Nat?
Yes.
So my daughters were fortunate to have both Bob and Clarence as their jazz directors. And I interviewed them, showing them the visual diagrams and then also the soundtracks. And these are a few of the things that they said. So Clarence said, generating ideas from the jazz process, that automatically comes from the creative abstractive improvisation, which I thought you guys might like. And he also said, if you want to use all these, the three times lane, it would be a full jazz band. Then Bob said that his interpretation of the timelines is represented the collaborative process between Gillespie and Parker when they were engaged in composing Anthropology. So, so these are my data and representations, and this Magritte is, I keep this on my door, and what it means to me, we're trying to understand this process. We're trying to understand the design process. We're trying to understand how people learn about design processes. And like you're talking about qualitative measures, we can't see what goes on in people's brains. So we have to take lots of different measures from lots of different angles and then triangulate. And so that's what the Magritte painting means to me. You have to squint, you have to take a lot of measurements, and then you have to have the faith to run with what you see. So.
Hi, my name is Dharma Dailey. I've been a maker and instigator of improvisational art for many years. When I was introduced to Cindy Atman's design timelines in my PhD coursework at the University of Washington, I saw a connection between the patterns in the timelines and the patterns that I experience in creating improvisational art. Cindy and I hatched the idea to see how other improvisational artists would respond to her work. So we brought together vocal improvisers from around the Puget Sound area. They sat through the same presentation that you just saw, and having never encountered the work before on the spot with no preparation or discussion and no particular agreed upon rules, created these musical interpretations of the timelines on the fly. What you are about to hear now are those spontaneous interpretations the vocal improvisers came up with for real selected design process timelines that resulted in either low, medium, or high quality artifacts. Now we're going to listen to the spontaneous interpretation of a design process that resulted in a low quality artifact. What's notable here is the brevity and lack of coordination. Now we'll listen to the spontaneous interpretation of a design process that resulted in a medium quality artifact. What's notable in this case is the lack of diversity in design activities. Now we'll listen to a spontaneous interpretation of a design process that resulted in a high-quality artifact. Note the complexity of coordinated interaction in this process. Finally, in this excerpt of a spontaneous vocal improvisation, note the diversity of activities and how well they become interwoven with each other.
Go,